My name is Gaspar Rivera Salgado. I'm the director of the UCLA Center for Mexican Studies. And I have the good fortune of working with a lot of friends here institutionally supporting this event. So thank you to the Latin American Studies Institute, the Center for International Migration, the Department of History, and the Social Science Division, as well as the UCLA Chicano Studies Research Center for their support in this event. I would like to start. And there is an echo there.
Maybe someone is not there.
Is somebody watching also the? Okay, thank you. So let me start with a land acknowledgement. The Center for Mexican Studies at UCLA acknowledges our presence on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Gabrielino and Tonga people. So we're in for a very special event. We wanted to organize this event to break the ice, to bring everybody together, to celebrate that we can be in person now, but also to celebrate a very special colleague and all her accomplishments, and especially the publication of this book with this very attractive title. I was telling her that she has to tell us this story. When I saw it, hey, bad Mexicans. And also, this is a special book for me, Kelly, because it's about my paisanos, my fellow Oaxaqueños, these radical revolutionaries who were transnational organizers, right? They were troublemakers in Mexico, and they were troublemakers here in the United States. So it's a wonderful story, and we're in for a treat. Thank you, Kelly, for this book, and of course, Kelly Lytle Hernández does not need a presentation. This is her home territory. History department is here, but I just want to say that, you know, she's I saw her recently at a press conference in front of City Hall, being engaged actually in this big debate that we have in Los Angeles about what is the Latino political agenda, but especially what is multiracial political coalition building. And it was very nice to see in full force the presence of UCLA, people who have been engaging with these very same issues. And Kelly is one of those persons who's been engaged with crucial questions, really addressing the issue of what is the role of a public university in addressing the most important issues of our city, and how can we engage those issues with thoughtful, rigorous research. So thank you for your contributions here at UCLA, Kelly. And also, we have a member of the Faculty Advisory Committee, Fernando Pérez-Montesinos, assistant professor in the Department of History at UCLA. And the first person that came to mind to engage with Kelly in this book was Fernando, because Fernando is another transnational fellow too. He's from Mexico. He studied a lot of Michoacan, the Meseta Purépecha. So that was also close to my heart. And just thinking about this issue of how Mexican history evolves to incorporate the United States, and especially Los Angeles. So I thought that Fernando would be the perfect person to engage with Kelly. So both Fernando and Kelly had agreed to have this presentation as an interview format with questions and answers right there. And so Fernando has prepared some very provocative questions, been rehearsing to interview Kelly Lytle Hernández. So please help me welcome both Kelly and Fernando, and thank you everyone for being here. So take it away, Fernando.
I don't know. Do you want to say something first, or do you want me to open up the conversation? It's whoa. That was my bad. Sorry.
All right, say here. Yeah, right? No?
Good.
So I can start just giving a brief description of the book. How about that? And then we'll get into your questions. So Bad Mexicans, it tells the story of this group of Mexican dissidents, journalists for the most part, who were organizing in Mexico at the turn of the 20th century to oust a dictator from power. That dictator's name was Porfirio Diaz. Porfirio Diaz liked to call them malos mexicanos, bad Mexicans. That's where the title of this book comes from. After years of suppression, of arrests and whatnot in Mexico, they fled and they came to the United States, where they rebuilt their social movement, they relaunched their rebel newspaper, and they even started an army. And it's really an army of the dispossessed, of migrant workers and cotton pickers and whatnot. And they raided Mexico 4 times between 1906 and 1910. And those raids sparked extraordinary concern, anxiety here in the United States, because by the turn of the 20th century, the United States had major investments in Diaz's Mexico. So the idea that he couldn't control politics, he couldn't control workers in Mexico, was frightening to some of the most important people in the United States. So the United States and the Mexican government worked together, and they stitched together a cross-border counterinsurgency team to suppress their revolution before it could disrupt US investments in Mexico. And so Bad Mexicans tells the story of how they built their social movement here in the United States. And probably more important, it's the story of that cross-border counterinsurgency campaign that tried to stop them. But they were successful, and they incited the outbreak of the 1910 Mexican Revolution. So that's the story in a nutshell.
Okay, thank you, Kelly. So before I engage in the questions, I just want to open up by saying that this is, of course, a wonderful book. I really like the way you presented the story. One way to highlight the importance of the book and how difficult it is for someone to actually summarize the events that are in the story is through other people who have already addressed the story of the magonistas. So in his book of the magonistas, Claudio Lomnitz wrote the following lines, buried somewhere in the middle of a very thick volume, actually. I quote, "The story of the magonistas is still awaiting for a Mexican, John Le Carré, to bring it into its own," end of quote. And he immediately added, "That is not my aim here. An anthropologist by training, a superb scholar, Lomnitz recognized that his writing skills were more in line with the philosopher and the social scientist than with the spy novelist. But here we are today, not with a Mexican John Le Carré, but with one of the finest historians of the United States, who is neither a Mexican nor a white British male, but has finally brought the story of the magonistas into its own. That, I think, is cause of celebration." So because of that, precisely because of that, because the choice of having someone who is focusing or has focused on the United States and the borderlands, the choice of writing the history of the magonistas seems a little bit odd. So I would like to start the conversation by asking you, how is it that historians of the borderlands and the Mexican West and the American West felt compelled to write about this group of Mexican revoltosos, as they were often described?
That's a good question. So I have a couple of answers to that. The first and the easiest answer to that is, of course, in my last book, City of Inmates, which is about the rise of mass incarceration in LA, I write about the magonistas because they are incarcerated in Los Angeles and they helped to organize the Mexican Revolution from solitary confinement in LA County Jail. So in some ways, I had their archive collected and digitized and ready to go because of that work I'd done in City of Inmates. And that's very much an LA, US story. That's the easy answer. The harder answer is that I grew up on the border, and I'm a borderlander. And I first learned about the magonistas here at UCLA in the history department, taking a Mexican history course with Wilkie. And there was a text that we read, and there was just a paragraph or two about the magonistas. And immediately I was like, how have I never heard of this rebel movement before? I'm from the borderlands. There should be common knowledge in our communities, especially communities of color, laboring communities, and revolutionary communities. And I hadn't heard of them, and I was concerned that this was a major story that I had never heard before. So that's the personal reason why I wrote the book. And then the political reason, there's a lot of political reasons, but the big one, of course, the title is a reference to bad hombres, right? And so when Trump made his disparaging remarks about Mexican migrants who are doing nothing but trying to secure a better life for themselves, he was stirring sort of that rhetorical pot of racial violence that, as historians, certainly as a historian of the borderlands, anti-Mexican racial violence, that I really wanted a broader public to know and to understand that when he uses that kind of language, he's stirring up, he's calling out, he's summoning extraordinary levels of anti-Mexican, anti-Latino racial violence. And so, you know, as a historian, some of the work we do with rapid response. We do the press conferences, we do, you know, reports with $1 million hoods and other things. But as a historian, the response is much slower. So it took like, what, 6 years or something like that to get the book done. But it's because it's deep, it's archival, it's historiographical, we're doing the labor. So that's another one of the reasons why I thought it was really important to tell this story at this time, that there was once upon a time another autocrat who thought to disparage Mexican organizers and workers and people who are seeking a better life for themselves as malos mexicanos, just as we have an autocrat today who disparaged Mexican migrants who are working and seeking a better life for themselves as bad hombres. And I wanted to start building those connections as a historian. So that's why I thought the story of the magonistas, which has historically and traditionally been told as a Mexican history, was really critical for us to know here in the United States broadly. Now, of course, Chicano organizing communities have known this story. I mean, that's not new to everyone. It was new to me, but it's not new to everybody. But I wanted a broad public to know their story, which is why it's a trade press book and why it's written as a spy novel that you talk about.
Well, thank you. So I know that some of you are familiar with the story of the magonistas, or at least we know the contours of the story. But can you lay out for us a little bit of why these people were especially harassed by the US and the Mexican government? Why, what made them so special? And sort of lay out who the magonistas were and what they wanted, like in general, where they come from, how they came together, like a brief picture of the magonista movement, very heterogeneous, diverse, and very combative. So yeah, can you tell us a little bit about where they came from, what they wanted, how they became such revoltosos, and how they became so dangerous for higher powers?
Sure. So we'll shout out to Oaxaca, right? Several of the leaders of the movement are from Oaxaca, Ricardo Flores Magón and his brothers in particular. But more generally speaking, who are the magonistas? They are a group of dissidents, people who become writers, right, to kind of formulate the confrontation with Porfirio Diaz. They use the written word as their major weapon. And they have a series of critiques. It begins quite modest, right? The initial critiques against the Diaz regime are more about corruption in government and in the judiciary in particular. But as they begin to confront the state, they experience the repression, right? They experience what opposition feels and looks like in a dictatorship or under a tyrant, and their opposition becomes much more capacious. So they move from attacking just the judiciary to attacking the government more broadly, suppression of democracy, voter suppression in particular. And then they also begin to talk about the economy, which is a major radical shift. And they're starting to say that Porfirio Diaz has turned Mexicans into, quote, the servants of foreigners in their newspaper. Now, Diaz did not want anyone talking about the ways in which foreign investors, I mean, European and US investors were coming into Mexico, buying up or being given millions of acres of land, and then building up these enterprises that subjected Mexican workers to, well, initially dislocation, dispossession, but also really Jim Crow or Juan Crow forms of labor and labor control in Mexico, whether it be in the Yucatan or up in Sonora and elsewhere. And so they began to critique that expansion of US capitalism and white supremacy into Mexico in ways that rattles the cages of US empire. And so that is very concerning to both Diaz and to the United States government. So their own political journey, their intellectual journey, certainly is an evolution from small protests, smaller issues, to these much larger global economic critiques of modern capitalism and white supremacy. So that's who they are, generally speaking. They bring the anarchist battle cry, land and liberty, to the Mexican Revolution, right? We want land, right? We want economic change, and we want political change. Can I tell you about a couple of the people? Sure. Okay, so that's what a book like this really does, is it brings the people to the fore and the ideas that they carry with them. So of course there is Ricardo Flores Magón, who is known as the leader of this movement. That's why they're called magonistas, right? Followers of Magón. Many people quibble, certainly. They say we're not followers of Ricardo, we are our own individual liberals, but we can set that aside right now. So Ricardo Flores Magón is brilliant, absolutely brilliant. And he has a way with words. His tongue is, his pen are extraordinary weapons. He is the one who's able to summarize the crises that are happening in Mexico and write them down and start to connect the dots. So the newspaper that he starts in Mexico City with his brother and some others, Regeneración, one of the reasons why it's so important is that people have been making local critiques across Mexico and having their own individual experiences with the regime, in particular experiences with dispossession, yes, but also experiences with sexual violence. That Porfirio Diaz had empowered these local government officials in ways, and he didn't pay them very much. He said, basically, I'll empower you to bring in votes for me. In exchange, I'll allow you to tax the local communities. I'll allow you to marshal up armed guards. And I'll allow you a rapacious kind of power in your local communities. And there are so many families across Mexico, so many women and girls in particular, who had experienced sexual violence at the hand of these local Mexican authorities. That it's Regeneración that begins to publish their stories from across the country. And people start to realize, oh, it's not just here. It's not just here. It is across the entire, there's corruption at the heart of the regime, right? So we're moving from local change to national broad-based change. So it's those kinds of stories that he's telling, that they're telling in the page of Regeneración about economic land dispossession and sexual violence and more, that helps bring together this revolution. And some of the people who are telling these stories alongside Ricardo Flores Magón, this brilliant but combative personality, are people like Juana Belén Gutiérrez de Mendoza. I want everyone to know her name. Juana Belén Gutiérrez de Mendoza. She's an extraordinary autodidact from the mountains of Durango. She, from a very young age, teaches herself to read and then is able to go to school. And she marries a miner and moves around the country up into northern Mexico. And she cuts her teeth as an organizer by protesting the conditions for miners, her husband, and other miners. And she's arrested so many times and sent to the local jail so many times that she just stopped signing her name on the jail forms. And rather than sign her name where it says name, she writes sedition and rebellion. Like, Juana is bad. She's like one of the baddest bad Mexicans ever, right? She goes on, she moves to Mexico City. She begins her own anarchist feminist newspaper. She also is in community with Ricardo Flores Magón and the others. She's arrested numerous times in Mexico. She's imprisoned at Belén prison, this horrific colonial prison in Mexico City. And then when the magonistas flee Mexico to come to the United States, she comes up north with them. And one of the things that's really remarkable is as Ricardo Flores Magon's power begins to grow, right? He's becoming known as one of the most famous dissidents in Mexico. It's Juana who steps to him and is like, you know what? This isn't about you, Ricardo. When Ricardo's mind and head starts to get a little big, this is about the principles at play. And she's the one who's checking Ricardo Flores Magón when really no one else will. They have a terrible falling out, which I won't tell you all the details of, but it does show the ways in which Ricardo Flores Magón was irascible, right? And really, I think, a very difficult personality. So many people have written about Ricardo Flores Magón. It's he's a hero, he's a god, he's much more problematic than that. It's a relationship with Juana that exemplifies that.
I mean, I imagine that he was really a lot to take. Like at times he was like, and a very annoying person. But again, he was also very clever and very intelligent, and he knew how to basically infuriate people in order for them to get them motivated. And then he was, of course, I imagine very also very loyal to his friends, and that was part of the issue, that he felt betrayed when people would not go along with his ideas, and he probably had abandoned issues or something like that, but he was a lot to take. And then Juana Belén and others would, of course, shape also not only Flores Magón ideas, Ricardo Flores Magón ideas, but the whole of the magonista movement. And that is one of the things that the book highlights. It focuses on specific individuals to bring out the story more lively, but at the same time, it makes it clear, at least that's how I read it, that this is a movement, that this is a network of intellectuals, militants that are working together within a basic framework that they are essentially building along the go as they confront Mexican authorities, as they confront US authorities, as they face racism in the United States, as they try to build a revolution. So these are friends, really, in many ways. And then Juana Belén is this extraordinary individual who later on would publish a feminist paper, Vesper, and please take on that story for us of Juana Belén.
Oh, sure. Well, there's just a couple more things. So she breaks from Ricardo Flores Magón. She goes back to Mexico. She relaunches her feminist newspaper. But I think what's most important about Juana Belén Gutiérrez de Mendoza is that when Ricardo Flores Magón says, I'm an intellectual, I'm here to lead the revolution from my mind, but not with my body. So you all go get guns and fight. And I'm going to stay here in Los Angeles and write things. Juana was like, no. And she goes back to Mexico. She hatches all kinds of urban plots against Porfirio Diaz. She joins Emiliano Zapata's army, becomes a captain in his army, helps to ghostwrite his Plan de Ayala. She goes on through the revolution until she passes in, I believe, 1943, leading a variety and participating in a variety of social movements for indigenous rights, for women's rights, and more. She's extraordinary. So you think about all the people who are remembered from the Mexican Revolution. I just want to make sure Juana gets her flowers, right? So she's a huge character. So I'm really glad that I can just give her some attention in this book, and many other women in particular who have not been given, I think they're, by many scholars, they're just due in this movement.
So there is also alongside Juana Belén, the Villarreal sisters, for instance, who also help essentially with the bailing out of Ricardo and other well-known magonistas. So there's a core group of female activists that are not only checking Ricardo's ideas, but really shaping an ideology that later on would actually made it into the Mexican Constitution.
That's right.
Article 123 of the Mexican Constitution is about labor, and it gives equal rights for equal payment for equal work independently of gender. Then they call it sex, right? So it equal pay for equal work independently of whether you were a man or a woman, a male or a female. That's in the Constitution. And the Constitution was written by men. There were no a single woman in the writing, in the drafting of the 1917 Constitution. Where did that idea come from? It came from Juana Belén and from the Villarreal sisters. It came from the magonista movement that was pushing these radical ideas that would otherwise would not figure in the ideological spectrum of radical Mexicans, including Ricardo, who was, sometimes difficult.
So, okay, I have a question for you.
Sure.
That's really interesting, because when I've been going around doing book talks, some of the pushback I get from scholars is, well, but the magonistas didn't win and they didn't impact anything. So what's the point of telling this story? And I'm hearing you say, actually, they did. The ideas that they moved forward become incorporated into the Constitution at minimum.
Yeah.
And they, I would argue, shift the ideological frame and sets of possibilities for the revolution with their demands around labor and gender and land, subsoil rights and more. So you agree with me?
I do.
Okay.
Yeah, of course.
That's okay.
But also because part of the story of the magonistas is that they're breaking away with the liberal framework.
That's right.
They are beginning and working within the liberal framework. They are all about individual freedoms. They are all about individual rights and all of that, that they essentially, they were building on a very long tradition within Mexico that made liberalism the mainstream ideology in Mexico. Even Porfirio Diaz was liberal. Everyone was sharing that same matrix of liberalism. The Mexican Revolution was about breaking not only the regime, but breaking away with liberalism, pushing the envelope further. And that's where they became really important. That's Juana Belén makes it into the Plan de Ayala, the most significant radical manifesto of the revolution. Then the Constitution has also this imprint of the magonistas there. And then there is a bunch of newspapers and people who were associated with the magonista movement that you actually tell the story here about, that end up creating labor unions. Antonio Sotigama also was associated with the Zapatistas. There is a bunch of Jacobins. That's how they were labeled in the drafting of the Mexican constitutions, that were essentially part of the magonista movement. And then some of them joined Pancho Villa, some of them joined Carranza, but they are everywhere. Essentially, they're pushing the boundaries of liberalism to create a new ideology for Mexico, more radical, more social, based on labor rights, not individual liberties. And that is the story that essentially is in this book. It's the story how this individual from Oaxaca, who was at some point a bohemian that didn't want anything to do with politics, then becomes this first radical liberal, and then he ends up being an anarchist. So this story is an evolution of people engaging with the challenges of their time, and it's peppered with these amazing characters. For instance, Praxedis, right? Can you tell us a little about him?
Yeah, I love to. My editor accused me of being in love with Praxedis, which is probably true. So Praxedis Guerrero was like this blonde scion of a fairly wealthy family. He grew up with private tutors and doing horse races, because it's equestrian races, and he wrote poetry. He was this very well-to-do young guy. But he also had this rebel spirit inside of him, and he ran away from home when he was very young. He decided he wanted to go work at a beer factory nearby until his mother found him and came and dragged him home, right? He joins the military, kind of a voluntary minor military role. And when there is a massacre of protesters, liberal protesters, right, in Mexico, in I think it's about 1903, he decides to leave the military and starts to wonder, sort of like, what's his relationship to the state, right, the regime in particular. And he ends up leaving Mexico and says, I'm gonna go ahead and go to the United States like so many other Mexicanos are doing, and I'm gonna live as a laborer, right? He sort of sheds himself of all of his power, all of his entitlement, all of his wealth, and he goes to the United States and he becomes a migrant laborer. He works in the lumber camps, the lumber yards of Colorado. He works on the docks in San Francisco. He winds up in the mines of Southern Arizona. And it's in the mines of Southern Arizona that he meets up with some of the magonistas. We're doing a lot of organizing in the mines of Southern Arizona. And he was like, yo, that's my crew. And he joins really, really quickly with the magonistas, organizes a group. He came north with his best friend and a very young boy. I didn't write this in the books. I have no evidence. I think that they're lovers, him and his friend. They come north, they all join the magonistas. And the thing that's so amazing about Praxedis is that he's a writer. He's got that power of the word. In some ways, he's a stronger writer than Ricardo Flores Magón, because Ricardo would write these diatribes. Like, I really can't even quote Ricardo because the sentences, right? They go on for pages. You're like, I don't even know how to break this up or chunk it up to provide to any. They just go on and on and on. And they're just heavy, right? They're just really intense. Praxedis came up with these little phrases, right? Like, if you can't walk to freedom, then run. Boom, right? And he'd put them on these little like pamphlets and he'd send them around the borderlands and people would just hand them around. So I call it like the Twitter handle, right? Of the early 20th century. So a little bit of rebellious and reap a harvest of revolution. Boom, right? He was just telling you what this is about. Praxedis was an incredible writer. So he takes and makes possible for people to use through oral or to tell through oral culture, what's the problem here? And so that spreads like wildfire. He uses, what's the famous phrase that he takes? It's better to die on your feet than to live on your knees. That famous phrase from the Mexican Revolution, Praxedis is the one who brings that forward into the Mexican Revolution. So he's a writer and a very popular writer. He's also a fighter. Again, when Ricardo Flores Magón ensconces himself in an office in Los Angeles, is like, everybody go fight. We're going to send you boxes of revolutionary books and guns. Praxedis literally writes on the office window, hombres, like, are you men? Like, come on now, let's go. And he goes down to Mexico and he fights and he dies in one of the very first battles of the Mexican Revolution. He also organizes some of the armed raids into Mexico in 1908, some of the most significant armed raids of the magonistas. So Praxedis is just this extraordinary guy. Between his mind and his commitment, he says, I am action. I will fight, right? And he's got all these just really dramatic scenes. One time, the US Marshals and the early FBI, they track him to a hotel in Houston and they have a stakeout early in the morning at the hotel. And one of Praxedis's friends goes out early and sees all these marshals. And he's like, yo, we recognize these dudes because they arrested us back in San Antonio and some other places. So his friend runs inside the hotel, runs upstairs, bursts into Praxedis' door and is like, they're coming for you, right? Praxedis ties a couple of sheets together, throws them out the window, jumps out the window just as the US Marshals are coming in. The sheets break, he falls a story onto his back, shakes it off, keeps on running, and the marshals are just up in the window like watching him run away. He has escape after escape after escape like that. So he keeps on going until he dies. He's shot in the head on a rooftop in Mexico in 1910. So he's pretty extraordinary as well.
So I want to take us back to the opening of the book. You opened the book in a very peculiar way with the lynching of a Mexican in Texas. Why did you decide to open a book of Mexican revolutionaries with a lynching in Texas?
That's a writing question for the
Mhm.
most part. I will say that the murder of Antonio Rodriguez is covered in the historiography, Mexican historiography of the revolution. He's almost always mentioned that that murder is an inciting incident in the revolution. So it is in the Mexican historiography. I wanted to bring it to the fore because what this book is doing is putting the magonistas in US history and using their story to open up the canon of what we understand as the American story to Mexican-American themes and experiences in particular. So how do you make that shift? Well, I want to talk about race. I want to talk about empire. I want to talk about policing. One of the key historical frames that we have for understanding that here in the United States is the story of racial violence and is the story of lynching. So it's like an anchor. I'm telling you, this is how we're going to enter and understand the story of Mexicanos in the borderlands, of the suppression that the magonistas experience is through the lynching experience. Now, everything, you don't know anything about the magonistas, you don't know anything about Mexican history, you don't know any of that, but you do know something about the history of lynching. And I want you to use what you know about that to ground yourself in this story. That's the writing choice about why I started it right there. Also, I have been talking to a colleague, Mark Vestal, who is our co-lead on the $1 Million Oats project. And he was talking about Toni Morrison and one of her most extraordinary first lines, which is they shot the white girl first. And that line was going over and over and over in my head. And if you can ever do it, just try to grasp for Toni, Miss Morrison. Just grasp. You're not going to get anywhere close. You're not going to get miles within, but just go for it, right? I held that line in my mind and in my heart for how to understand race and racial violence. And that helped me come to the first line of the book. And that shifted everything. And the first line is, they lit the pyre and they watched him burn. You have to know, who are the they, who is the he, and why is a human burning? And that is what opens the story. So that's why I did that, was to yank it out of the Mexican historiography, to ground it in US history, and to offer it to a broad audience. To hear, use what you know to start this story.
Because part of the book really is about some of the wealthiest individuals on the planet freaking out about a revolution in Mexico because they picture the revolution as a race war against them. And they think that because of things that they are doing in the US and they are replicating in Mexico. So they're freaking out about the magonistas instigating a race war, really. And that's part of the story of the book that I think it's not in other narratives of the magonistas. That introduces the magonistas into this world of white supremacy, of Juan Cro, and all of that Mexico sort of starts to see with the big corporations of the Standard Oil and timber companies and other essentially company towns that were built upon the foundations of segregation, essentially. So Mexico is starting to do that, but you really, that's what I really like about the book. Well, I love many things, but that part, introducing the magonistas into a world that it's essentially dominated by white supremacy, makes it even more radical, the revolutionary efforts of the magonistas, because they were really going against not only capitalism in Mexico, but a specific form of capitalism that had been imported from the United States. So yeah, that's why I ask you about why open a book about the magonistas with something that happened in Texas. And also one of the other highlights of the book is the way the ability that Kelly has to produce images, to paint pictures. And then she makes, because she's a historian of the American West, unlike many historians in Mexico that have talked about the magonistas, she can examine and analyze for us the world in which the magonistas essentially were inserted, like the brown belt in Texas. So can you tell us a little bit about why you make those choices and why it is important for you for telling this story to describe the brown belt in Texas and other passages in the book that really paint a picture of Juan Crow, essentially?
Mm. Well, I think this goes back to part of my politics for writing this book. History is poorly known in the United States, period, right? That we can we just stipulate that and agree? Mexican American history it's almost non-existent in the broader general public. So I'm gonna be really clear, this book is a strategy. You have a riveting, cinematic, extraordinary story that has everything. It's got armed battles, it's got secret codes, it's got betrayals and love affairs, it's got everything in terms of just a good story. So I was like, we have to use this story and to smuggle into the broader sort of US imagination and memory, key moments, key dynamics in Mexican-American history. And we can talk about why that's important. I think we can just assume why that's important in this room. And so the history of white supremacy and how it's impacted Mexicans and Mexican Americans is a key component of that. The Brown Belt is this region of Southern Texas, South Texas, that has always been, or not always, but long been majority Mexicano, right? Mm-hmm. Most people speak Spanish. The sort of center of gravity for politics and culture really points south, not up toward Boston, right? And sort of the power relationships in South Texas and the struggle over land and politics are really key to the formation of Mexican-American life and identity and belonging in the United States. For example, in San Antonio in 1896-97, there's a Mexican man who applies for naturalization, for citizenship. And there's a protest basically around his application for citizenship. And so there's a case that's heard in Texas that litigates whether or not Mexicans are eligible to become US citizens. Because going back to the US Naturalization Act of 1790, naturalization reserved for free white people. The question in 1890 San Antonio is, are Mexicans white? Because if they're not white, you're not becoming a US citizen if you're not Black coming out of the US Civil War. So what are Mexicans, racially speaking? That battle over Mexican-American racial identity, which gets decided in a case, Henry Rodriguez in 1897, saying that yes, Mexicans can become US citizens and by definition are formally white, is hugely important to race relations across the course of the 20th century. The formal designation of Mexican Americans as white, the often but not always racial subordination of Mexicans in everyday life, largely under the rules of Jim Crow, get applied in a Juan Crow dynamic in South Texas and Southern Arizona and Los Angeles and elsewhere. That sets up a really important conversation about race and racial inequity that continues right on up to our city hall today, right? Where do Mexican Americans fit in US racial dynamics? And that has been a contest around whiteness and non-whiteness in particular. So I wanted to talk about all of those things. You can't understand immigration control. You can't understand the border unless you understand it as a racial formation, right? So all of that is really at the heart of this book. The Brown Belt is a piece of all of that. And I really think like in the last couple of weeks here in LA, another thing that's important right now, a lot of people are talking about, are Mexican Americans or Latinos or Hispanics, whatever, choose your term. Are they gonna be Democrats or Republicans? are they going to be radicals? Anti-capitalist, anti-racist, radical. I mean, there's another option. There's another legacy that I want to make sure people know in front of them.
Mhm.
So you think about everything that's happening right now, the conversations in LA. What is the relationship of, let's just say, Mexicanos to Black folks, to Indigenous folks? Where are they going to fall in those historical sets of relationships of power? And we are watching that tussle happening in real time on hot mics right in front of us. And this book really kind of helps people understand why that's a contest, why that's even a conversation. Or this story. I forgot what your initial question was, but I just started talking.
Well, yeah, I mean, it was about context, about putting the magonistas in context, but
right.
other context, a different context than just Mexico. And because they spent essentially 15, 20 years here. And my sense is that the book, although that's not probably the purpose of the book, is also teaching Mexicans about life of Mexicans in the US. If you live in Mexico City, really, the border is something weird, abstract. It really doesn't resonate with you. That you ignore how people really live on this side of the world. And I think the book will make that or makes this contribution to the study of the magonistas. It's just we know that the magonistas spent years and years in the US, that they were imprisoned, that they were harassed, and then they, of course, organized here. They were, of course, in touch with international workers, and that here is where they really become anarchists. We know all of that, but part of the answer that that's in your book is part of the reason that they became so prone to anarchism and socialism is that they met with other people that were already facing equally challenging problems with Juan Cro policies and how the US operated at the time, not only Mexico. So basically they are part of this larger international community that are facing different forms of capitalism. And they happen to cross the border and encounter this world that you describe very creatively. And I think that's a big contribution of the book. I know that you want to make the book about for American readers, but I think that part will appeal to, or at least I hope that's the case, to Mexican readers, just so that they can have an idea of the really challenging life that Praxedis Guerrero and Juana Belén and Enrique Flores Magón, Ricardo's brother, had in the US. They were essentially poor. They basically got by, and they were living by the day, and they were riding by night, but really they had like shifts, 12-hour shifts. So they abandoned a life of comfort or relative comfort in Mexico to come to the United States where conditions for Mexicans were really harsh. So that makes the story also more appealing. Why you would do that? The Porfirio Diaz dictatorship was, of course, harsh, but they could easily accommodate themselves within the system. They were intellectuals, they were part of the middle class, they were Mexicans, so people in Mexico looked like them. They were not facing discrimination, really, but then they decided to come to the US, and that world is what they encounter. And to me, I think that it makes them think differently about Mexico and about capitalism in general. But I digress. There is this also chapter on the postal service in the US. And just so you know how good it is, the narrative of this book, Kelly makes the US Postal Service something interesting. Can you tell us a little bit about why the history of the US Postal Service is relevant for the study of the magonistas?
Well, there's two parts of that, right? So the reason why it's important for the story of the magonistas is that Mexican spies, US spies hired by the Mexican government are able to penetrate the US postal system, either buy off workers or they plant workers. So they begin stealing the rebels' correspondence, their letters to one another. So imagine someone watching your social media to figure out where you are, what you're saying to people, if you have plans or your email for an armed revolution, where that's going to be at what time, right? So they're trying to stay on top of all the rebel activities. So they penetrate the US postal system largely with the postal system's assistance, right? The US postmaster's assistance. He says, you know what? It's illegal for you to just go around opening up people's mail. You can't do that. That's a felony. But if they were to leave their mail for 30 days or more, and it becomes a dead letter, then like en route, when those dead letters get sent to DC, if you were to open them up and just copy things down and then put the letter back in, totally cool. And they advise the Mexican government and their spies that this is a process that they can utilize. And it's by following all of those stolen letters, which is the major archive of the magonistas. All those stolen letters were saved by the Diaz regime, sent down to Mexico City, put into an archive so they could study them, they could decrypt them and all that and follow the rebels. And now there's this incredible treasure house for historians to take us to the front lines of the revolution, right? So in those letters, people are having fights with each other. You called me this and he's no good, that kind of stuff. But it's also 5 p.m. in Parral, there's going to be 6 guns ready under this box behind this cuartel, you know, that kind of thing. You got everything in those letters. So that's why the Postal Service is really important to understand. It's also important to understand that this isn't new for the Postal Service or for mail politics, right? In the sense that during the period of enslavement, abolitionists were sending revolutionary material into the South that would get picked out of the mail and then burned, right? Any correspondence about birth control in the late 19th century, early 20th century was criminalized, right? And so people were mailing rebel correspondence around birth control. So their involvement with the Postal Service and why they become suppressed through it is important. The other reason telling the post, like I spend, I don't know, like a page or two talking about the history of the Postal Service, which is pretty long in a book like this. It's also important, again, I'm trying to make this argument that you cannot understand US history without Mexico and Mexicans, period. Something as mundane as the US Postal Service, you cannot understand without Mexico and Mexicans. So that's why I keep pushing on all of these things that seem kind of like ho-hum standard histories and infusing them with all new light, right? By including new characters, new protagonists. So there's sort of a dual reason as to why I engage in that activity.
So can you tell us a little bit about how is it that the magonistas were essentially in the middle of international campaign to imprison them? How US Mexican authorities cooperated, how they coordinated, how they found obscure laws to have them extradite to Mexico, how they failed to do that because they couldn't. The magonistas also had a team of lawyers and radical lawyers that would defend them. So can you tell us a little bit about how the intricacies of how close did the Mexican government work with the US to pursue and harass the magonistas?
Oh, well, I mean, that's like at least half of the book. So I'll just give you a couple of examples. I mean, everyone's involved. The US Department of War, US Department or the Immigration Service, the Marshal Service, the US Postal Service, local police and sheriffs across the country. the very beginning of the FBI, one of the FBI's very first cases is chasing down the magonistas. So every sort of dimension of the US federal, state, and local government are involved in this counterinsurgency campaign. How does it manifest itself? Well, for example, in September of 1906, the magonistas launched their first armed raid into Mexico from southern Arizona, or from southern Texas, on the small town of Jimenez, Mexico. That causes all sorts of consternation in the United States, that Mexicanos would be so brazen, right, as to arm themselves and mount themselves and attack Diaz's Mexico with a goal of unseating Diaz and threatening US investments. So across the borderlands, there are armed forces, US military is sent in to occupy, but also in southern Arizona, around those mines where there've been a lot of magonista activity that we talked about, where Praxis Guerrero and all them are, the US Immigration Service works really closely with the local Mexican consular official to go and track down all the magonistas living in the area. So they began with the US Immigration Service raiding all of these mining camps up in the mountains and other places. And they would arrest magonistas, take them to the local jails. And then when they couldn't get them formally extradited, the US Immigration Service was like, that's cool. We don't need extradition. We have this new thing called deportation. We've never really used it against Mexicans. It's really a tool to get the Chinese out, right? Which Immigration Service at this time was really an anti-Chinese immigration service. They had no, Mexicans were not in their purview at all. But they very quickly turned that lever of power, right? That technique of power created to remove Chinese immigrants from the country. They turn it and they subject Mexicans to it. And so they deport Mexicans into Mexico, right into the hands, literally right into the hands of this guy named Emilio Kustrelitsky, who is a Russian immigrant to Mexico, who becomes really the lead captain of the armed forces, the rurales, basically in northern Mexico. And he is doing all kinds of suppression across northern Mexico for Diaz and for US investors. Well, US Immigration Service takes all these, they round up all these magonistas, they put them in jail, they try to extradite them, but they can't do that. So they say, hell, we'll deport them. They deport them right into the hands of Emilio Kustrelitsky, who takes them into Mexico, and they disappear. We don't know what happens. They were either imprisoned or disappeared or killed. It is unclear what happens. They're never heard from again. That's one example, right? And the US Immigration Service, which again, this is 1906. No one, in 1906, Mexicans don't even have to register to enter the United States. They don't have to, they're not counted. Mexicans are not considered an immigration problem. I know it's hard sometimes in like our presentist world, by the federal government, they are not considered an immigration issue at all. It is all about Chinese. Well, when the magonistas start their armed raids, the immigration officer in charge in southern Arizona writes this letter to his boss in DC and says, basically, I know we're not concerned about Mexicans, but these Mexicans are bad Mexicans, literally, right? These are really bad Mexicans. They're causing a lot of trouble down in Mexico for our citizens, white citizens who own a bunch of property and businesses down there. And we got to round these dudes up and we got to punish them. That's a letter that he wrote to the US Department of Commerce and Labor. So that's one example, and the Mexican Council is right there with them, aiding them in these raids on Mexicans in the borderlands. But I mean, it's just every example, it's them working hand in hand, the US and Mexican government to suppress them.
And the two governments in the
was there any, if this group did not exist, was there any other impetus or group they could have perhaps become the same power? Existing, not after.
That's a good question. I mean, there are a lot of rabble rousers. I mean, the magonistas are not the only people who are pushing for the outbreak of what became the Mexican Revolution. So I don't think I don't think the revolution hinges upon them. I think that you probably know this better than me. But I think that they are players, they are protagonists, they are inciters of the revolution, not singular insiders, but they are insiders. And their particular contribution is just as Fernando has outlined, with the radical sets of possibilities around labor and land in particular. So I think something would have unfolded without them, but
Yeah,
differently.
I mean, part of the other part of the story is that the political climate in Mexico is changing very fast. And part of the reasons that the magonistas are not as successful is that they don't read that political climate as well as others in Mexico. There is an election, and then a wealthy individual that is part of the lead challenges Porfirio Diaz. He was, of course, imprisoned, but unlike the magonistas, he got out because he was rich. And he goes to the border, and then he drafts the Plan de San Luis, which is the beginning of the Mexican Revolution. And his movement becomes successful, in part because he knows how to read. Francisco Madero, that's the name of the individual, how to read the political situation in Mexico, in part because he had the means to instigate a rebellion against an equally powerful rival, and in part because he understood that Mexico is a very heterogeneous country that welcomes radical ideas, but at the same time, it welcomes classic liberalism. So there is what I would say 3 different sources of revolution in Mexico. One is the magonistas, the other one is the moderate liberal branch represented by Francisco Madero, and the other one is the land-based popular liberalism represented by Zapata and perhaps Villa. Like this liberalism that is not ideological, it's very pragmatic. It sometimes welcomes anarchists and socialists, but really is based on the history of each little village fighting against a landowner or a miner. So it's a very locally based type of bad Mexican. The other one is, again, it's more classic liberalism, trying to win over the middle class, but not really pushing for revolution. So that's more or less a complicated way to say that there were these 3 sources of change, if you will, in Mexico at the time. Yeah. So I would like just to finish, and maybe we can open up with other questions from people to end this with if you tell us a little bit about the importance of regeneración. In the end, one of the major contributions of the magonistas is the newspaper itself. We talked about how US authorities intercepted these letters from the magonistas, but the other great source is the newspaper itself, the Regeneración publication. So what is Regeneración? What is the relevance of Regeneración? And yeah, can you tell us a little bit about this crucial newspaper in the history of the revolution?
Yeah, so Regeneración is a newspaper. They start in Mexico City, and when they come up to the United States, it becomes like their primary goal is to relaunch the newspaper, because this is how they communicate across liberal and emerging rebel communities, how they share ideas about what we think is wrong. It's how, in the end, they crowdsource a manifesto, their very first manifesto that happens through the subscription list to Regeneración. It's how they build community, right? That's beyond what you can see, right? Beyond what you can touch. And so Regeneración is absolutely critical for spreading ideas, for sharing ideas and building community. And it becomes even more so once the magonistas come north to the United States. And it's pretty extraordinary. I mean, when they're in the United States, they restart it first in San Antonio, and then when someone, it said, breaks into the Regeneración office and tries to stab Ricardo in the back, they flee. They go to St. Louis and they restart the newspaper in St. Louis. And it's in St. Louis that the U.S. Postal Service, in collaboration with the Mexican government, determines that they can no longer use secondary or second-class postage, which means second-class postage makes it a lot cheaper to send your mail. So that's a suppression tactic and technique. What do a bunch of people who are well connected with migrant laborers do? That's cool. We've got a free system, right? So they start smuggling the newspaper down to the border, putting it into the hands of migrant laborers who are stuffing it into their shirts, putting it into their hats, taking it across the borderlands and into Mexico and passing the paper along. So the paper is important itself, right? Because it helps to share the ideas, but not everybody can read, right? You're talking about a community that's over 70% illiterate, right? So you're talking about people reading the newspaper out loud by campfire, in bars, at schools, everywhere, and then through oral culture and tradition, moving the words and the ideas far broader than the newspaper could ever go. So that newspaper just becomes a really important anchoring tool to the emerging revolution. And after Ricardo Flores Magón is arrested, I mean, the office is raided in St. Louis. He goes on the run and starts to live underground. He's going everywhere, Texas, California, Canada, everywhere. He ends up settling in Los Angeles, and they restart the newspaper in around 1907. And they rename it, right? They've been spending years organizing, building, raiding, and they renamed the newspaper Revolution. Like, it's coming. It is very, very near. And they publish Revolution, which is the rebrand of Regeneración from Los Angeles, right up until basically the start of the Mexican Revolution. It's an extraordinary newspaper.
It is, yeah.
Yeah.
And then just to give you a sense of how important it was thousands of copies in a country that was mostly illiterate were circulating in Mexico at a time when the press was constantly harassed by the Diaz regime. So it doesn't really make sense how they managed to do that at the time.
That's people power.
Yeah,
We're
and
moving
they
that.
had to carry the press with themselves. It was a physical press. It was not, there were no software. They have to, of course, use different types. So it was a physically challenging thing to do, to publish a clandestine newspapers. Yeah. So I have many other questions, but I think I already monopolized a lot of the conversation. So maybe some of you want to participate.
And also have some questions from the people watching the webinar. So we'll do that here. So go ahead.
Ben's got one.
Thank you for this extraordinary conversation. It's illuminating. I have, many questions, but one of them has to do, Kelly, also Fernando, with whether the magonistas use a lens of race and white supremacy to understand the world in which they were living and that they were trying to change.
Yeah.
In the different kinds of liberalism that Fernando laid out for us, there was sense of economic inequality, sort of in that sense, very strongly influenced by notions of class and class-based oppression. But what about race? Was there any sort of discussion about the fact that this was actually a component of the social system and the unoppressive social system in Mexico and transnational?
So yes, I think class is their primary lens on revolution. And I think just as he has indicated is the confrontation with Anglo white supremacy in particular that elicits new ideas. So for example, there is I'm sure you know this, an uprising at a mine in Cananea in 1906. And that uprising is of Mexican miners who are protesting against a US-owned mining company that had brought in Anglo-American managers to live on top, like literally live on top of a bluff and nice houses and schools and rectangular streets and all that kind of stuff. While the Mexican miners have to build their homes out of like the refuse of the mine. They live under the toxins of the mine. They're dying of lung disease left and right. They're paid a whole hell lot less. And because of Jim Crow, Juan Crow forms of occupational segregation, they cannot rise to the level of manager. There's just a rule. There will be no Mexican managers, right? That is an Anglo-American job here in Cananea. So the uprising in Cananea that happens has a strong racial lens. Like they brought in, I think at the quote is something like they're blue-eyed, blonde-haired managers, right? They're seeing this as a racialized form of class subordination, right? So that's where, and that's magonistas are in the mix at that uprising. That's one example where we see race coming to the fore of their analytics. But it gets stronger over time. And by the time that Antonio Rodriguez is lynched in Texas, the response to that lynching, Praxedis's article in response to it in particular is whites, whites, whites. That's how they're beginning to understand. So it took years of experience, right? Both in Mexico and the United States to bring together what and understand racial capitalism, right? But I think by 1910, 1911, they are absolutely getting to that understanding of what racial capitalism is. That would be my take.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Any other questions in the room before we go to the webinar? Here and there, and then we'll go. Chris and then Ruth.
Okay, when you said that you were prompted in part to write this book by sort of reacting to anti-immigrant and racist politics, and it took you 6 years to do it, I thought of another historical project prompted by some of those same impulses that took a number of years to do, which is Ken Burns's Holocaust series. And part of what I then thought of is, well, gee, the Holocaust series is all about how it's just humanitarian imperative that's being overruled by racism, anti-Semitism, and nativism. And that's true. And it's also, you know, it's how you talked about sort of Mexican migration or Latin American migration, is people looking for a better life. On the other hand, part of what motivated the restrictionist legislation in the 1920s was fear of anarchists, communists, socialists, sort of alien radical ideologies. That was one of the ideologies at play there too. And it's true that East European Jews made up a lot of the radical labor movements, you know, the rank and file of some of the left parties in the United States. And it's also true that Latino migrants in the United States have been really important in building the anti-racist movement and building the labor movement. So there's sort of this tension between saying, this is just humanitarian, this is just people like you and me trying to build a better life, and celebrating radicalism and saying, actually, this is great, you know, that there's radical people coming here. We need more radical people and more radical ideas and new radical ideas. So I just was wondering if you had any thoughts on sort of when, what audiences, what discussions you celebrate radicalism as opposed to sort of giving the very basic humanitarian argument.
I hope I always celebrate radicalism. I hope I don't ever mute that. But yet we have to be tactical in the sense of how you introduce a conversation and where you begin the conversation, depending on who you're talking to. I mean, if you're talking to third graders, if you're talking to Democrats, I don't know, right? You have to figure out who your audience is and bring them along. For me, one of the most important pieces of this story, right, is rebuilding that legacy of Latino anti-capitalist, anti-racist organizing and what that can mean for us today. And I didn't know the city council was going to blow up precisely the way that it has blown up. But this is an opportunity. This crisis is an opportunity for people to get really clear about where they stand in relationship to capitalism and white supremacy, among other things, right? So I think at heart, this is a radical story. And that is the punchline of it all. I'll leave it at that.
Good.
And then you got-
One more question, then we'll go to here and then we'll go back to you, Cesar, and, okay, go ahead, Ruth.
Okay, so thank you so much. I grew up as a kid in a small town in Mexico, and my grandparents' house was on Magon Street.
Wow.
And I never really knew the story this way. So love that. So thank you. My question is, can you talk a little bit about that shift for Porfirio Diaz? Because in your book, as you were telling his story as a child,
Yeah.
the opening, I thought you were talking about Benito Juárez,
Mm.
right? I don't know if that was intentional,
Mm.
but then I was like, oh, no, this is Porfirio Diaz, and this is how his upbringing and whole connection with Juárez mentor, and then where the shift happened for him becoming a dictator.
Mm. Well, so the first two chapters of this book are all, well, the first section is all in Mexico. The first two chapters are largely on Porfirio Diaz and his regime. And those are probably the hardest chapters for me to write. As a US historian, right, who's working in, multiple fields, but one of them in which Porfirio Diaz is always the demon, like, and just period. No one complexifies his personality or his life, his experience. It's just like, he was a real asshole and we're gonna leave it at that, right? And so I was like, okay, well, I entered with that frame, that's all I've ever been told, but I had to get into a story of who he was as a boy, right? And understand his rise and his transition. That's a totally different way of getting to know a human being, right? So fortunately, Mexican scholars have done a considerable amount of work to tell his biography and all that. So I was able to rely on their work. I couldn't tell you exactly when he goes from being this liberal sort of general, right, and Jacobin in some senses, to being, anti-imperialist, right, exactly, to being a dictator and tyrant. I would assume it's somewhere between his first, second, and third elections, right? That was that taste of power, because right, he comes to power saying no re-election. And then very swiftly, first puts his friend in power, right? And then comes back and he changes the Constitution and gets reelected, I don't know, 7 times. I can't remember how many times right now. I think it's that taste of power. He legitimates it by saying there's been so much political chaos in Mexico for over a century that we just need a stable hand, right? And I've got that real strong stable hand. I'm a military general, and he must have been incredibly charismatic, right? And so he just holds on to it. It's like, if you let me go, it's all going to go to hell, right? I'm what stands between you and hell. So I think that's how he legitimates it. But when he internally made that shift, I don't know.
I mean, we will never know,
We'll
of
never
course,
know, yeah.
but yeah, it was probably after the liberals won the French against the French intervention, essentially, when he was actually a presidential candidate 3 times before he took the presidency by force. So he really wanted power, and he really felt that he deserved to be president of Mexico. So that moment after, like the early 70s, even before he reelected himself, he was already like, yeah, sort of thinking too high of himself, and he wanted power, essentially, from the very beginning. He made different transformations. He became more authoritarian. He abandoned any sort of social ideology, and then he, of course, became part of the economic elite as well. But yeah, it was very early on, after he was defeated by Juárez and other liberals in the ballot. He couldn't be president by means of an election. So that to me says everything. It's like, yeah, he wanted power from the very beginning.
Before going back to these questions in the room, I just want to read 3 short questions, 2 short and 1 a little bit of comment from people online, and then we'll go back to close this session with these questions in the room. So 2 very specific questions from the audience on the webinar is, Carlos Agredano is asking if you know anything about the influence of the magonistas on El Plan de San Diego. And the second one is by Carlos Amador, who asked, how did they decide to land in Los Angeles as opposed to other parts of the Southwest, or even going to Central America. And one of the other comment is from somebody who's based in Mexico City, and she's commenting that every year the federal Mexican government highlights a historical figure as the year of, and this is the year of Ricardo Flores Magon. And the Magon, if you see any website by the federal government, Ricardo Flores Magon picture is there. So she's asking that we're also in the middle of this conversation about how a lot of foreign interests are buying property in Mexico, especially along the coast and along the borders, in conflict with Article 27 of the Mexican Constitution. This is an interesting phenomenon that echoes back to the pre-revolutionary Mexico days and the Partido Liberal Mexicano political platform. Is history repeating itself? Any thoughts on this current situation? So 3 very specific questions and 1 general comment.
So the first question about El Plan de San Diego, the final chapter in the book is on features El Plan de San Diego. In many ways, I mean, there's a lot of reasons I wrote this book. In many ways, El Plan de San Diego is this uprising in South Texas led by Mexicans who put together an army of all races, a liberation army of all races and people. And they are determined to kill every white male over the age of 16, to free up lands across the southwestern United States. The very first set of lands were going to be given to African Americans as a sanctuary from white supremacy. The second set of lands are going to be given to indigenous peoples as a sanctuary from settler colonialism. And the third set of lands, Mexicans are going to start talking about who gets what. This is an extraordinary moment of radical imagination and possibility. In the summer of 1915, they enter the United States, they join up Mexican Americans as well, and they begin killing white men across South Texas. The US military is sent in, every white person is deputized, vigilantes, and hundreds of Mexicans are murdered in retribution for El Plan de San Diego. Estimates range from anywhere from like 300 to 3,000 people. It is one of the most significant uprisings against white supremacy in US history, and it's Mexican-led. And it is one of the most significant racial massacres in US history, and no one talks about it. To understand El Plan de San Diego, you have to understand the magonistas, because it's the magonistas who inspire that uprising in many ways. Some of the old cell leaders, focal leaders from the magonistas raids are involved, but also just the foment of the magonistas is what emboldens this really radical edge of the Mexican Revolution to look north and go like, yo, we just kicked Porfirio Diaz out. We're running a revolution down here in Mexico. Look north. What more can we do? That's El Plan de San Diego. That's everything that terrified the United States. You have your little revolution down there. That's fine, right? We'll have our shenanigans. We'll make sure we get our guy in power, and we'll just run. Don't turn your guns north. That's always the greatest fear, right? What this ripple could mean for settler colonialism, white supremacy in the United States. So the Plan de San Diego is a major moment in US history, and nobody talks about it. But to understand it, I got to tell you all about the magonistas. Otherwise, it comes out of left field. You wouldn't understand the intellectual history, the genealogy, the political genealogy of it. So yeah, please everybody read about El Plan de San Diego. It's really, really important. I'm not good at compound questions. What was the second question?
Why did they come to LA and
why did they come to LA? They came to LA because LA had this really growing Mexican immigrant population. It's a little farther from the border. There were so many Mexican immigrants living here. They had, beginning printing presses and all of that. They had the capacity, and it had a really strong focal of Mexican socialists and wobblies and magonistas that were here in Los Angeles. So that's why they come here. And then the third one was about, does history repeat itself? I mean, I don't know if foreign investors ever fully left Mexico in a variety of ways. So I don't know if it's about repetition, it's about continuity would be my, I don't know what you.
Yeah. And it's mostly a story that dates back to the 80s, 90s with Carlos Salinas, making changes to the constitution that the magonistas helped to draft indirectly. So yeah, I don't think it's history repeats itself, of course, but the same forces that led to revolution or to social tensions are still at play all over the world, really.
Let's finish
Yes,
this
over
session
here.
with questions in the room. So Cesar was first, and then there was
David.
back in the hand and.
Yeah,
Okay.
Yeah, I have a question about the kind of social base for the magonistas, because my understanding is the largest group of subscribers to Joe is actually sugar beet farmers here and in Colorado. That's one thing. And the other is, I'm surprised about this, killing every white male in the sense that the way I had it, the magonistas have been influenced by the Western Federation of Miners and the industrial workers of the world. And these were mostly white, right, William Haywood, whatever, white radicals. So, is there a breakdown of the class focus of the magonistas by the time of the
Good question. So the first one, this is an actual really important source of tension in the literature about who were the magonistas writ large, right? I would argue from the subscription list that they are at least a substantial proportion of them are workers, right? Migrant workers, beet workers, cotton pickers, and miners. There are others, I think, who look more at the leadership, right? And they're all intellectuals, they all have law degrees, they're all journalists, and say, actually, it's a bourgeoisie revolution. This is a debate in the literature. It's, I don't think we'll ever resolve it, mostly because of the surveillance and subterfuge that they had to go through. So many of their identities are concealed. To me, it's the evidence of the moving of the newspaper to the migrant streams, the few subscription lists that we have left, which we have those, because whenever, in some cases, when magonistas were arrested, they had a subscription list, maybe like in their pocket, and they would use those subscription lists to sort of mobilize people when revolutions were getting started. I'm with you. I think they're mostly or substantially workers, but that is a debate that I don't know if we'll ever resolve. The second question is more difficult. So there are 5 years between when 4 or 5 years between when the magonistas led by Ricardo Flores Magón really crater, and the socialists largely go back to Mexico and the anarchists stay in Los Angeles. And he really becomes like an old crank on a commune out in Edendale, and they were printing out a little bit of Regeneración, but it's not very many subscribers. It really, there could be a break, right, that happens. The people who sort of pick up the mantle later on for the Plan de San Diego, the initial people who write the plan, we think, I don't know if they were magonistas directly. So I don't know if there's a direct link. They raid the United States. There's a suppression that happens. The Texas Rangers and others raid one man's home. They kill his son, arrest his wife, and he had been a subscriber to the magonistas and to the anarchist lens. His son's name, one of his son's names were Praxedis, named him after Prax. He is the one who becomes the strongest connection. So he didn't write the manifesto, but he becomes one of the strongest fighters in the uprising. I think that's a really good question that has not really been explored historically, but that would be my first answer. There's different pockets. They're not all magonistas.
Awesome.
Hey, friend.
David Turner, new faculty member in the Department of Social Welfare. First of all, thank you for this book. I think not only as the part of it, but I think it helps to capture so many different elements of how we study social movement, right? So we talk about social movement repression, talk about diffusion, get things out to other people, right? So I think with like the different sort of elements of looking at this from a social movement lens, right? If I were to take this book to an organization organizing Black and brown communities in Los Angeles right now, right? What are 3 key lessons that you would organizers who are organizing right now to build Black and Brown solidarity, to build, I think, a radical Mexican or Chicano or Latinx consciousness, right? Like, what are 3 lessons that you would want them to take from this?
I love it.
That's the whole punchline of the book. So that's my friend David over there, collaborator. The first one is that there's a deep legacy of anti-racist, anti-capitalist organizing in Mexican-American communities. And here is the foremothers and the forefathers of that story, right? So if you're wondering, how do I fit politically? I want you to explore this possibility, right? I don't forget about the anarchists, the socialists, thinking about being radical and oppositional. That's what they open up, right? We don't need to have the sectarian debates over that. That's one thing. And probably the most important thing to me. The other important piece is just the stories, right? So many Latinx youth I'm hearing and have heard don't feel themselves to be protagonists in the US story, historically speaking. Like, open up books and never see themselves, right? Or people who reflect their communities, at least not books that are about US history. And for all of us to see Latinx folks as protagonists in the US story, who can help lead, who can help to push, who can be oppositional. I think it's important for all of us to see and to read. I think it's important for those of us who are in the movement around mass incarceration to understand the ways in which the FBI in particular was formed, cut its teeth on suppressing Mexican and Mexican-American radical organizers. The way that that happens is that Praxis leads 3 really lethal raids in Mexico. Dozens of people are killed in June of 1908. Well, on July 1st of 1908, the US Attorney General and President Theodore Roosevelt established a new police force called the Bureau of Investigation. And the Bureau of Investigation has 2 or 3 initial cases. One of those cases is hunting down the magonistas and making sure that they don't start a revolution in Mexico. The FBI, which goes on to be a counterinsurgency superforce, especially in the Black freedom struggle, right? And AIM and other communities, they are formed. They learn how to do what they do by chasing down and suppressing Mexican radicals. We share a history, we share a story, and no one ever wants to tell us about it. And that's the power, right, of our amnesia, of our forgetting, is that we struggle to build community today because we don't know how we built it in the past. So that, I think, is a big part of it. I wish I had more evidence of Black-Brown work in the Magonistas, but there are glimpses of it. When Ricardo Flores Magón is on the run, he's living in many different places, but he ends up in Los Angeles, as we know. And he ends up in a home rented to him by an African-American agent here in Los Angeles. That cannot be a mistake to me. And the community he's living in is right, the upper edge of South, was becoming South Central at that time, right on Pico Boulevard. To me, I think, is Black folks offering sanctuary to this radical possibility. The other one is in early 20th century, African-Americans are still able to recall when Mexico was one of our flight paths to freedom, right? So if you were in Louisiana, if you were enslaved in Louisiana or Texas or Mississippi, it's easier to get to Mexico than it is to get north. And at least 10,000 of us found sanctuary in Mexico during the period of enslavement. There's towns all along northern Mexico. Nacimiento de los Negros. That's Nacimiento, Mexico. Parral, Musquis, all these towns are founded by or really populated by us, right? Those become really important towns in the Mexican Revolution to come. Really, no one other than Gerald Horne has talked about sort of Black-Brown history of the Mexican Revolution, but I think there's a lot more work to be done about the importance of northern Mexico in the coming revolution, which so much of the fighting happens in northern Mexico, and the role of African-Americans, the Black freedom dreams, in making that such the hotspot of the Mexican Revolution. With the idea being, if they can kick out Diaz, well, we'll just leave Louisiana, Mississippi, Florida, and we'll go get land there and we'll find our freedom dream. So that's happening. And when the magonistas do finally raid Baja California in 1911, after the revolution begins, Black soldiers join their occupation of Baja California. No one has been able to explain why all these African Americans show up in Baja California. I can't explain it during the magonistas' occupation of Baja. But there have to be some kind of connections on the ground that were being built to create that sense of possibility for people to go. I don't know what those were. Well, I don't think we'll ever know. There's no archive of it. But if you pay attention to these incidents, I think it's clear that there are engagements that are happening that haven't been recorded, or we haven't found the archive for it yet. So the Mexican Revolution is many people's freedom dream. And we engage with it. Pancho Villa, I mean, he ends up going north to the Chicago Defender and meeting with folks like, hey, so this whole revolution thing, what can we do together? People don't talk about those dimensions. So I think when we talk about going out, talking to young folks, Black and brown folks in particular, there's what's in the record, but it's also what can we imagine what was happening during this time period.
There was another question.
I love that.
I'll just do one. It kind of piggybacks off his, more global aspect. So I'm a PhD student for history of Kenyan prison system experience. I also do case studies in Mexico and the US. So you bring up a very great collaboration. And of course, you the city of inmates. You bring in the indigenous, you bring in the Americans, you bring in the Mexicans, Chinese, and bring them all together, putting it in the narrative of Los Angeles history. And in this book, Mexican, of course, stands at fourth chapter spoken as well. So my question is, well, other parts of the world, such as places, Africa, most of the countries with autocratic rulers, which is who push for high surveillance, harsh law enforcement, and suppression of identities. Do you think there can be a coalition or an intellectual collaboration, or even awareness, activism, radicalism between Mexicans and their history, Africans and their history? It's unethical longevity. Long question.
I mean, anything's possible. You're going to make it happen. You're the one doing the case studies between all these places. So no, not on the connections that you're talking about. Absolutely. Why not? I mean, it also can go back. So the Mexican Revolution is the first social revolution in the world of the 20th century. People worldwide are watching what is happening in Mexico. Christina Heatherton has a new book out, Arise. Subtitle is The Mexican Revolution, Global Dimensions or something like that. And she's tracing all the various folks who are coming into and through Mexico during the revolution to kind of learn, how do you do this? Really interesting book. So I would recommend checking that out. But it's just a matter of us building the relationships and making those connections. And it sounds like you're doing something new. And maybe you'll be the scholar activist that makes it happen. Arise by Christina Heatherton.
And with that very positive thought about a potential beautiful future, please help me thank Kelly and Fernando for